Now, some of the cities in the book of Acts were counted as free cities. If it was a free city, regardless of whether it was in an imperial or a senatorial province, then no Roman garrison or cohort was stationed there. Here's a list of the important free cities in the book of Acts. Syrian Antioch. Now that's important because Syria is such an important imperial province, the most important of the eastern imperial provinces. But Antioch, the capital of Syria, was a free city. No Roman cohort stationed there. Athens was a free city. Thessalonica was a free city. And Ephesus was a free city. That explains then why we don't have any soldiers running on the scene in Acts chapter 19. Ephesus was a free city. You got 25,000 people or somewhere in that vicinity revolting, and the town clerk handles them. Well, first of all, it's not an imperial, it's a senatorial province, but even there, it's a big city and it's an important city. But yet, because it's a free city, that it has no Roman cohort stationed there. So some of the cities were considered free. Those are the four most important ones for our studies because they appear so often in the book of Acts. Antioch, Athens, Ephesus, and Thessalonica. Then another phenomenon of Roman control, we're still here under law and order, is that the Romans sometimes would establish what they called colonies. Colonies. A colony was more or less, it was like a Roman city transplanted there. The whole thing was set up with Roman citizens from beginning to end. It's kind of important and interesting to know this as you read the book of Acts and you hit Paul in certain chapters at certain cities. And then you want to ask yourself the question, is this an imperial or senatorial province where this city is located? We don't always know, but sometimes we do. Furthermore, does it have soldiers there? Who's governing? Is it proconsul? Is it prefect? Is it legate? Do we have soldiers? Is it a free city? What about, is it a Roman colony? Then it's a little miniature copy of Rome is what it was meant to be, not with an emperor or the Senate or anything like that, but a Roman city that was transplanted there. The most famous and the most important one, as Luke spells it out for us, is Philippi, Acts chapter 16 and verse 12. Acts 16 and verse 12. Here's the one that Luke spells out for us, definitely, as a Roman colony. So you kind of have to have that pictured in your mind. It's like a little Roman city has been transplanted there. People from Rome, whenever this city was founded or refounded, it existed in antiquity, were moved here from Rome or from other parts of the empire and established here so that we would have what we would call a Roman colony. Acts 16:12. From thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony. And we were in that city abiding certain days. See, I have colony marked in because that's kind of interesting there. Now, the translation, who's got an NIV, reading from an NIV? What does NIV say? It is the chief city of that part of Macedonia. What does it say for that phrase?
From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia.
Okay. Leading city of that district of Macedonia. That's probably a good translation. What we have here in the margin is the first. Some people have seen where it says the chief city and have made Philippi the capital of Macedonia, but it wasn't. Thessalonica was the capital of Macedonia. So Macedonia, we understand, was divided up into various districts, and Philippi was the most important city in this district. It was not the capital of the region of Macedonia, but the most important in this district. But anyway, that's another subject in itself. The most important thing is that Luke calls it a colony. He says a colony. What's a colony? It's a Roman city of Roman citizens transplanted from Rome or other parts of the Roman Empire and established here to build this city as a little miniature copy of Rome. It's a Roman colony. Okay, I'll list the others in the book of Acts that were important Roman colonies. This is the only one mentioned in Acts as a colony. Pisidian Antioch. Remember, there were two Antiochs, one in Syria and one up in Asia. One in Pisidia, one in Syria. Syrian Antioch is a free city. Pisidian Antioch is a colony. Troas is a colony. Corinth was a colony. Now, Athens was a free city. Corinth was a colony. Ptolemais, the port, was a colony. And Lystra, Acts chapter 14, Lystra 14:8. Lystra was a colony as well. Okay, enough on the order, law and order being maintained in Roman society. See, this is getting not so much into politics, but more into the social spheres of the Jewish existence in various parts of the Roman Empire. So that as you read this and you see Jewish synagogue, we'll be to synagogues later. We'll be able to put all that information together with what we know about Gallio as being a brother to Seneca the Younger, and about what year, 55, 56 AD, that he's ruling there in Corinth. Paul stays there 18 months. A proconsul only rules for 1 year. He can't be there all year and a half that Paul's there then. How does that, where does Paul overlap? Does Paul start with the beginning and go up into, or halfway through and go beyond the 1 year reign of the proconsul Gallio in Acts chapter 18 and verse 12, I believe that was? Well, you see, that helps you better understand what's going on here. Let's move to another manifestation of their extent of control, and that is the area of capital punishment. We won't say much here because I've already shared this with you several times before. The most important thing was law and order. Another important facet of the extent of the Roman arm is in her keeping for herself the right of capital cases and capital punishment. The Jewish court had to receive the capital punishment decree handed down from the Roman prefect. This is nowhere more clearly spoken of than in John 18, verses 28 to 32. We've used that before in looking at Pontius Pilate. The Jews say, we have to have you decide the case. We've already decided he's guilty, but we have to have you pass the sentence and you carry out the sentence, or we will be in trouble. This is why Jesus spoke prior to his passion so often of being delivered over to the Gentiles. This was an important part of his pre-passion prophetic warning to his apostles. An important part of his pre-passion prophetic pronouncements to his prophetic apostles, if you want all P's in there. Mark 10. I mean, this is interesting in itself. He always spoke of, I'm going to be delivered over to the Gentiles. Why did he say that? Because he knew what the Roman law was, and he knew the Jews could never crucify him until they first of all go through Roman authority. He knows that. That's part of his prediction. Therefore, he is predicting things in his culture, in his environment. Mark 10, verses 33 and 34. Notice what he says here. You see, you just wouldn't get this otherwise without a study into the Roman society and culture and her social ways and so forth. Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be delivered unto the chief priests and unto the scribes. Oh, that came first. Remember the trial before Annas, the trial before Caiaphas. They shall condemn him to death. What did they say? Blasphemy. He's worthy of death. And shall deliver him to the Gentiles. I mean, he's got a whole prophecy of the step-by-step nature of his manifold trial that we've looked at earlier. He's before Annas, he's before Caiaphas, then he's before Pontius Pilate. He has to go before the Gentiles. And who's Pilate? Is he a Jew? No, he's a Roman who's come as prefect of Caesarea. stationed in Caesarea. So it's just remarkable how he predicts this, and it's certainly prophecy, because maybe the Romans could have called him first because of something that he said or that he did. But he does give this prophecy in light of his own, at that time, existing knowledge of how the society was set up. The chief priest, the scribes, they'll condemn me to death, then they'll deliver me to the Gentiles. They shall mock me, scourge me, spit upon me, kill me, and the third day I'll rise again. So it's all a prophecy, step by step, of what's going to take place. Note also Acts 4 and verse 27. See, I can already emphasize the fact that you're really getting a thorough teaching through all of this, that just it saturates your mind with not with 20th century history, but first century history, so that we are very careful not to read into the Gospels or the epistles or Luke's narrative of church history, the book of Acts, our own predispositions, preconceptions, presuppositions, misconceptions, how we are disposed to think of something in our society, in our setting, whenever we just indoctrinate ourselves and fill our minds with how this whole Roman thing, as it were, the whole Roman government and the whole Roman Empire was set up. For of a truth against thy holy servant Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel. Now it's reverse parallelism there. Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, the people of Israel. In other words, it's like A, B, B, A. You know how that's poetry? Okay, who's the first one? Herod. Who's next? Pilate. Who's next? Herod, remember, is a Jew, part Jew. Pontius Pilate's a Gentile. There's how it goes. That's the way he has this set up in reverse parallelism. For of a truth against thy holy servant Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, there are two of the leaders, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together. Okay, so capital punishment. Okay, a third thing, census. We don't have to say much about that. We spent a lot of time on the Roman census. That's Luke 2, verses 1 to 3. That's Acts 5:37. Another part of the extent of her control was the taking of a census. I don't know if you've heard of the term or not, but impressment, when you're compelled to do some type of service, impressment. Impressment. Okay, let's jump over to Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. We'll see the subject of impressment here that was so current and so popular in the first century. Matthew 5 and verse 41. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Well, you've probably heard of the explanation of this. Roman soldiers would oftentimes impress you. Impress in this sense, impress you into their services. The gear that they had to carry was too heavy. They would impress you and force you, compel you. The word is compel here. Compel you to carry their pack. Jesus said for a mile. He said if they impress you and enforce this upon you, impose this upon you to carry their gear, their pack, their whatever a mile, then show that you're my disciple by being willing and do it if necessary to carry it 2 miles for them. So here's impressment, practiced many, many times in the first century. Let's look at some other examples. Matthew 27:32 of Roman impressment. Matthew 27:32. And as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. Same word. Notice in Matthew 5:41, whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile. Here's the man who helps carry at least part of Jesus' cross. Him they compelled to bear his cross. Mark chapter 15, same account, but Mark chapter 15, verse 21. And they compel one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Now, the word compel here is a loan word. It's a Greek loan word that comes from the Persian language. So it's not a Greek term at all, this word compel, found in these three texts, Matthew 5:41, 27:32, and Mark 15:21. Compel is a loan word from the Persian language that spoke of the right of postal carriers to practice impressment on people, their animals, or property in order to spread an edict of the Persian monarch. And this happens to be seen, by the way, back in the post-exilic books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We'll look at that later in another context, by the way. We won't look at that right now. But let me say that again. This term compels, not a Greek term, it's a Persian term that spoke of the right in ancient Persia of postal carriers, you know, U.S. Postal Service postal carriers, who didn't drive in little red, white, and blue trucks, but on horses, mules, steeds, whatever. Postal carriers to practice impressment on people, their animals, or property in order to spread the edict of the king whenever a message had to be sent out. And you would impress the first person. If you were one of the official imperial postal workers or postal carriers for the Persian monarch, you'd find the fastest person who had the fastest horse, and you would impress their horse into your service. You would compel them to surrender their horse for the king's use, as it were. And so the Greek language picked up this word. It's a loan word from the Persian language, and it's found in these three places. And then Luke, who I do not believe has the term, he still has impressment in Luke 23 and verse 26. Luke's got the exact same account here, but he doesn't use this technical term. As they led him away, they laid hold upon one Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross. We could say they compelled him to bear it, that he might bear it after Jesus, but he just chose not to use that particular term. Okay, so we've seen four things: law and order, capital punishment, the census, impressment. Those are four of the important aspects of the extent of Roman control seen in the New Testament. We're not going to go beyond what we see in the New Testament because that would not really serve any purposes. We have to look at the subject of Roman taxation, and that will have something to do with the census that we've discussed earlier as being one of the things that manifests the extent of Roman control, but only in one aspect of taxation and only in one aspect of the census. Now, this is a fairly broad topic. Probably everyone from Sunday school remembers the render unto Caesar passage. It's such a famous passage. Even if you didn't go to Sunday school, you probably heard the render unto Caesar passage. Now, that's a famous, popular one in the New Testament. And what it has to do with, of course, is the subject of Roman taxation. So we've got a lot of information we're going to be looking at. The KJV, the word tax or taxing in the New Testament is only found in Luke 2 and in Acts 5. This is in the King James Version. The word tax or taxing is only found two places. Now, taxation is going to be found many. So we're going to have to find it under different terms then than tax or taxing. In Luke chapter 2, we'll have it in the first three verses as well as the fifth one, 1, 2, 3, and 5. But as we've shared with you before in studying the question and the problem surrounding the man Quirinius, or Cyrenius as it's spelled here in the KJV and Luke, we don't really have the subject of taxation here as much as we have the subject of a census being taken, enrollment. It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. Or you could just say that that he would take a census. But the way the King James is set up, and it's not the same in other translations, you couldn't say that all the world be censusized. So it's best just to put in enrolled. And this enrollment, or there you could say this census, was first made or first taken when Cyrenius or Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be enrolled, everyone into his own city, into the registers, the public registers, for eventually the later purpose of taxation. And then verse 5, to be enrolled with Mary his wife, being great with child. And of course we know that's talking about the 8 BC census, that probably because of the affairs surrounding the end of Herod's life was probably delayed in Palestine for at least a couple of years, so that it was actually effected in Palestine somewhere around 6 or 5 BC, which of course would be the date for Jesus' birth. And then the other place where tax or taxing is found in the KJV New Testament is in Acts chapter 5 and verse 37. Now, there definitely was a taxing at this time. We know that particularly from the writings of Josephus, that there definitely and actually was a taxing during this time, Acts 5:37. But really the word is back to the word in Luke chapter 2 where it should be something like census or enrollment. After this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of the census. Now this happens to be a different one than Luke's earlier writing. This is the AD 6 census here. And since Luke wrote a 2-volume work, it only makes sense that he gave us the first one, and that's the 8 BC one that was probably carried out around 6 BC, and then 14 or 12 years later. It was on a 14-year cycle, but if it wasn't carried out in Palestine in that first one in Palestine until around 6, and 12 years later in AD 6, of course, they had a 14-year cycle, remember, in the Roman Empire. Another census was being taken, and this one actually involved the taking of a tax. So taxing is okay, but it's really not the word. It's not the Greek term. The term should be something like census. But we do know that money was collected. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. Whereas in the first one mentioned in Luke, we have no reference or record at all of money being collected. Money was being collected on this second general one in Palestine. And drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. So we don't need to concern ourselves with really the word tax or taxing or taxation as appearing in the New Testament, because it doesn't appear. It doesn't appear at all. All of these taxing words should be changed to enrolled, enrollment, or census terms. So we don't have the term tax or taxation. But of course that doesn't mean we don't have it in the Greek. We do have it in the Greek. We have it in several different forms. First of all, let's look, before we really get to Roman taxation, which will be a little later, let's get to the subject of Jewish taxation. Jewish taxation. And, by the way, that reminds me of something else I wanted to say to you earlier that I just forgot to say. I didn't have it in my notes, and I remember thinking of it, but I had so many other thoughts when I was saying that sentence or two I was saying, I forgot this. I've said before, whenever we first began looking here at the social backgrounds to the period between the Testaments, that we would not spend a lot of time looking at the 400 years in between, the daily life of the Jew in between, because I said, first of all, you already know your Old Testament and what they were like then. They're basically like the first couple of centuries after the time of the close to the Old Testament, and B, because what we really are concerned with is how that period connects itself to the New Testament. And so to study what they were like under the Roman rule would be to fulfill our objectives. And then I could say, and C, it's not that we're not going to look at the daily life, but I have a whole other class entirely, it's already worked up years ago, that will deal with day-to-day living in Palestine. Whether it's Old Testament or period between the Testaments or New Testaments, we'll kind of combine that together. So I have a whole class worked up on that. So that's another reason. That's probably the chief reason I'm skipping over all of that right now in breaking it down day by day. What did they do when they got up in the morning? What time did they get up? What did they eat for breakfast? What time did they go to bed? What did they do for a living? All of that's going to be dealt with in the future in another class.
Hallelujah.
Okay, so getting back to Jewish. That's what reminds me of it, though, Jewish, because that would be the daily life of the Jews. Exodus chapter 30. No, we're not going to study taxation in the Old Testament because that wouldn't be period between the testaments. That'd be OT and not ITP. So we're studying this because of a certain connection we're going to see over in the New Testament. And if you don't know this, now this is going to be an important little reference or two that we make here to this subject of Jewish taxation. If you don't know this, then you confuse this issue that pops up over in the Gospels with the render unto Caesar issue. And they're not even related at all. They're not even similar to one another at all. One is a political issue, one is a religious issue. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in a moment. Exodus chapter 30 and verse 11. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, when thou takest the sum of the children of Israel after their number. Remember the book of Numbers? What's the basis for the book of Numbers? Where we get that title, Numbers? A census that was taken, two censuses that was taken, one early and then one after the 38 years wandering in the wilderness. So they had a census in Old Testament Israel. You almost have to have a census. I mean, whenever you go to the park, don't you do a head count every now and then of that family of yours? You have to. You look all around for those guys. You take a little local census there of your own family. You have to do that to control population and look for waywards and thieves and fugitives and all of this and make sure you've got all of your children there with you. We experienced that. We went to the zoo down in Memphis here several weeks, months ago, however long that was, and about 4 families with us there. And you're just looking, everywhere. And the children are between the legs of the elephants and then on the giraffe's back, and it's a lot you have to keep up with. So you just take a little head count every now and then. Then they shall give every man a ransom for his soul unto the Lord when thou numberest them, that there be no plague among them when thou numberest them. Okay, and here's the verse that we need, Exodus 30 and 13. This they shall give. Here's the ransom for their soul. Every one that passeth among them that are numbered, half a shekel, after the shekel of the sanctuary. And then he wants to kind of explain what it was then, that a shekel is 20 gerahs. Well, if you don't know what 20 gerahs is, then you don't know what a shekel is then. And if you don't know what a shekel is, how can you divide it in half? And half shekel shall be the offering of the Lord. And this will be something that we'll study in the other class that we'll get to. We'll have to discuss all of these numbers and figures in the Old Testament. What is a gerah versus the shekel? Everyone that passeth among them that are numbered from 20 years old and above shall give an offering unto the Lord. And the rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less. See how fair it was and how equal it was. The rich shall not give more, the poor shall not give less than half a shekel when they give an offering unto the Lord to make an atonement for your souls. Okay, that next verse is the one I'm looking for, because we'd ask ourselves the question: what was this tax for? It's a tax here, and he keeps saying, he said it twice here, that it's an offering, or 3 times. He says, first of all, it's a ransom for your soul in verse 12. Then in verses 14 and 15, he said it's an offering unto the Lord. And then one says an offering to make an atonement for your souls. But what it really was a temple tax that was given by everyone above the age of 20 for the maintenance and the upkeep of either the sanctuary or the temple, depending on which time we're living in. And he goes on to really spell this out more in verse 16. So it's called the temple tax, or it's called the sanctuary tax. They had the tabernacle, the sanctuary first. The temple's probably the best name, the temple tax. Thou shalt take the atonement money of the children of Israel, and shalt appoint it for the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, that it may be a memorial unto the children of Israel before the Lord, to make an atonement for your souls. So this was the half shekel temple tax that was required of every male. Of course, that's what the census was basically of men. Every male between the ages of 20 and 50. We're not given all of the information here. You have to get into the book of Numbers. He just says everyone above the age of 20. Well, he doesn't mean women. He only means men here. And he doesn't mean anyone who's 51 or above. Any male between the ages of 20 and 50 had to annually, this was a yearly temple tax, every Jewish male between the ages of 20 and 50 had to give a half shekel annual temple tax for the upkeep of the sanctuary. It appears just a few times in the Old Testament. In 2 Chronicles 24, verses 4 through 14, Joash used this money to repair the temple. And of course, that's what it was there for. It was a perfectly legitimate use of the temple tax, because that's what it was there for. It was a temple tax for the upkeep and maintenance of the temple, the tabernacle, the sanctuary. 2 Chronicles 24, verses 4 through 14.
For the continued
2 Chronicles 24, verses 4 through 14. And it came to pass after this that Joash was minded to repair the house of the Lord. And he gathered together the priests and the Levites, and said to them, Go out unto the cities of Judah, and gather of all Israel money to repair the house of your God from year to year, and see that ye hasten the matter. Well, you see, this was not being taken up at this time, and the people were not surrendering it voluntarily at this time either. And notice what he goes on to say, Howbeit the Levites hastened it not. The king called for Jehoiada the chief priest, and said unto him, Why hast thou not required the Levites to bring in out of Judah and out of Jerusalem the collection? And then you've got all this in italics, but it's supplied correctly, according to the commandment of Moses, the servant of the Lord. And you see you've even got a cross-reference back to Exodus chapter 30 there. So that's the temple tax. That's the tax, the money that he's talking about there. The congregation of Israel for the tabernacle of witness. For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken up the house of God, and also all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord did they bestow upon Baalim. So, of course, they need to refurnish some of the material and redo some of the interior of the temple. And at the king's commandment, they made a chest and set it without at the gate of the house of the Lord. And they made a proclamation through Judah and Jerusalem. Why aren't they making a proclamation up in Galilee and up in the northern area? It's fallen to Assyria. The only thing we have left now is Judah and Jerusalem. And they better serve the Lord and offer their temple tax, or they're going to fall too. And we know they don't, and therefore they do. They made a proclamation through Judah and Jerusalem to bring into the Lord the collection that Moses, the servant of God, laid upon Israel in the wilderness. That's Exodus 30, the book of Numbers. And all the princes and all the people rejoiced and brought in and cast into the chest until they had made an end. Now it came to pass, so they're pretty good at this time because a minor revival is taking place during this time. But the chest was brought into the king's office by the hand of the Levites, and when they saw that there was much money, the king's scribe and the high priest's officer came and emptied the chest and took it and carried it to its place again. Thus they did day by day and gathered money in abundance. And the king and Jehoiada gave it to such as did the work of the service to the house of the Lord, and hired masons and carpenters to repair the house of the Lord. How would you like to have been a carpenter on that work there? Also, working with gold instead of sheetrock. And also such, and cedars instead of little weak, no good pine. And also such as wrought iron, cedars of Lebanon, and brass to mend the house of the Lord. And so the workmen wrought, and the work was perfected by them. They set the house of God in his state and strengthened it. And when they had finished it, they brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, whereof were made vessels for the house of the Lord, vessels to minister. They offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord all the days of this good priest. Jehoiada was a good priest. He lives to be a ripe old age, 130, I believe, however old. Then he dies, and things go downhill after that. And then another place where it is seen in the Old Testament is in Nehemiah, chapter 10 and verse 32. We'll start reading with verse 28. Nehemiah 10:32 is where it's mentioned. A little short reference to it here. And you tell me what's changed and see if you can tell me why. The rest of the people, so we're in post-exilic days now, The priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinim, and all that had separated themselves from the people of the lands under the law of God, their wives, sons, daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding, they clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and into an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe to do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and his judgments and his statutes, and that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. And if the people of the land bring ware any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, we would not buy from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day, that we would leave the seventh day and the exaction of every debt. And we made ordinances for us to charge ourselves yearly with a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of God. Okay, what's different here? It's a third. Is that more or less than a half? That's less than a half. Why? Extreme economic situation in post-exilic Israel at this time. They probably just could not afford annually a half shekel. So it's a third a shekel. Now, in this little tidbits like this that you would never get in any charismatic service, you know, who cares about whether it's a half or a third? But something like this tells you something. Now, what did the law of God say? Did it say a third or a half? What did God's law say? It says a half of a shekel. You think Nehemiah is okay here? Certainly so. God takes into consideration that the times have changed now. That was stated in the law of Moses, a half a shekel every male from 20 to 50 annually. And yet we don't find any hint of reproof here. It's better than doing nothing at all. There had been no temple tax the whole time they're over in Babylonian captivity. There probably hadn't been a temple tax whenever they first come back. You know, the economic situation is too bad. They're trying to get the house of the Lord rebuilt. First of all, they're trying to build their own house. And of course, Haggai says that's a no, build God's house first. And then he'll give you plenty of money and plenty of time to build your own houses and to plant your own crops and vineyards and so forth. They're trying to get all of that done. They don't have any money. They don't have anything. It's this little isolated orphan community over in Palestine now. And so the religious leaders of the people come up with this idea that we will bind ourselves to an annual 1/3 a shekel temple tax. That's probably all they need is a small temple, smaller than Solomon's, remember. Of course, it's probably larger than the Old Testament Mosaic tabernacle, so you could argue on that basis that it's not valid. But I find things like that just interesting, that God seemed to allow something like that to take place, at least temporarily, for the people to get back on their feet, even though it's a direct violation of Mosaic law. What's God concerned about? The law or the spirit of the law? He's concerned about the spirit of the law. And what are they keeping? They're keeping the spirit of the law. Maybe you can only give 1/4 of a shekel. Your heart is right. You don't have to give anything. You could just keep all your money yourself. God sees the spirit of the person and the spirit of the law being fulfilled by them being willing to give at least 1/3 a shekel, although they can't afford a half shekel. And that seems to count on their side, seems to be okay with God. That's interesting in itself. Don't forget that little bit as you skip from Exodus over to Nehemiah, that God allowed that to change. Okay, references in Josephus are several in number. It actually becomes known in Josephus, probably the first time the terms really appear, as temple tax. It's found in Antiquities 382. Antiquities 382, as well as 1891. Okay, and then you ask me the question of what does that have to do with the New Testament and Roman occupation and all of this? Okay, turn over to Matthew chapter 17. Here's the only place it's found in the New Testament. And here's the only place where taxing in the New Testament is something that is connected to Old Testament Israel. It has a religious basis and has nothing to do with the Roman Empire, Roman occupation, the Roman Caesar, or anything of that nature. Therefore, the tribute render unto Caesar question is another question entirely, and it's oftentimes confused with the taxation question in the last 4 verses of Matthew 17, 24 through 27, simply because the issue is an issue of money. Okay, I'm going to read through this, and then we'll come back and comment as we go along. When they were come to Capernaum, that's way up north of the sea of, on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. They that received tribute money came to Peter and said, Doth not your master pay tribute? And he saith, Yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children, or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, Of strangers. Jesus saith unto him, Then are the children free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, now he's concerned about offense here. He's going to do something that he doesn't feel he's required to do. Why? Because he doesn't want to cause someone else to unnecessarily stumble. Oh, they stumble left and right around some of his teaching, but here's something that's not necessary. They stumble when he said, I'm Son of God. Well, you're just going to have to stumble because he's going to say that anyway. But here's something that doesn't have to be violated. Go into the sea, cast a hook, take up the fish that first cometh up. When thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee. Okay, you want to try to explain all of this, the background to all of this? I've mentioned this on and off, I know, over the years, and alluded to a little thing here or there. First of all, let's go back and correct some translations here. Now, remember whenever we were studying in biblical literature a theory of translation, we said that one of the big problems in the Bible is the issue of money. How do you translate it? You can't say $5 because $5 then is not $5 in 1920, which was not $5 in 1960, which is not $5 today. You would have to put $5 and then put in there a little inflationary adjustment figure. And how would you know what that would be, over the years, looking back or looking forward? So it's almost a no-win situation, as I've described to you before, this business of money. The KJV, we'll hear in the margin, many times right in the text, what they want to give us is English money of the 17th century. Well, that's not valid for us today, but it was valid for them. If this Bible, if we're going to only use this for a couple of years, and we can just put in current figures, well, figures change every month almost now, though. You could almost put it in and just use the Bible and then discard it. You'd have to have a throwaway Bible that would change. The government would publish every time they raise our prices. They would issue new Bibles at the same time, where everything would be correct and would correspond. Or you can give us some type of transliteration, which almost is the best thing to do. Just give us the Hebrew or the Greek term, and then let us adjust that in our mind. Let us know what that was to the Jew. Because, see, they didn't have like $5 and $10. It was shekels. Shekels was a weight, not a coin. A nickel is a coin. Now, it weighs something, but we don't really go by its weight. We go by the fact that a nickel is not a certain weight, it's a certain coin. Whereas a shekel in the Old Testament was not a coin at all. It could be a bag of something, but it had to weigh a certain amount. Now, that's different, of course, by the time we come to Roman coins in the New Testament. They're to coins there. Coinage doesn't come until the Persian period. If you're prior to that, if you're prior to the period between the Testaments, then coinage in the Old Testament is very unlikely. We've got coinage in the New Testament, but the way that it's translated is another matter. So let's go through this again. And when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money, and then money's italicized. And then the end of the verse, does not your master pay tribute? Okay, the words are exactly the same in the Greek. Why they gave us, the KJV gave us money italicized one time and didn't give it to us the next time, I don't know. The words are exactly the same. And you've got a fairly good word over in the margin, although they really give you the plural instead of the singular, called in the original the didrachmon. The didrachmon. That's probably the best thing to have here. D-I-D-R-A-C-H-M-O-N. It was a certain coin, and this happens, of course, to be the Greek name. This is the Greek name of the coin. And what do we have? Called in the original, I marked mine out, didrachma. Is that an A that it ends with? Yeah. Okay, it's really a plural form. Being in value 15 pence. Well, 15 pence is not the same back then as 15 pennies today. So all of that's just not valid. The only thing valid there is if you correctly spell the term didrachma. So that's what I have. What does another version? Anyone using another version this morning? Oh, okay. Okay. That's just an interpretation of the term here. I was going to say something about that in a moment. So what we should have here, and that's fine. Don't change that if that's what you have. I'll explain what they have done here in a moment. They that received the didrachmon came to Peter. That's the term. They probably gave us the plural in the margin because it's talking about two of them and not one. I'm just thinking of that now, but that's not the term. Doth not your teacher, would be a better translation than master, pay the didrachmon? Now they've come, evidently, it says here, to Peter, and they ask him. Now we don't know who the they is yet, and we don't know why they're asking the question. We just know they ask a question, does your master pay the didrachmon? Okay, a didrachmon was 2 drachmas. D-R-A-C-H-M-A-S. Didrachmon. Just means 2. Didrachmon. The 2 drachmas. A drachma was a day's wage. So 2 drachmas were 2 days' wages. So a didrachmon was 2 days' wages. Now that is really what you need. We don't need an amount of money, because what are we talking about? For a doctor or for someone who pumps gas? 2 days' wages. I mean, 2 days' wages stays the same, but what the amount is going to change with occupations, with time and everything. But as long as you know what he's talking about, 2 days' wages. So now let's read it that way. When they were come to Capernaum, they that received the 2 days' wages money came to Peter and says, does your teacher pay 2 days' wages? Okay? And he says yes. But I don't think he really knows one way or the other. He's just kind of caught in an embarrassing situation. So he just says yes. That's the easiest answer. If he says no, he's going to be in trouble. He's going to have to argue with these folks. So he says yes. When he was coming to the house, Jesus preceded him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? He knows what Simon said. He knows that Simon really doesn't know what he's talking about. What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, he's thinking here. Well, of strangers. A king. Does he take custom or tribute of his own children or of strangers? Peter says of strangers. Jesus said unto him, then if your answer is correct, then that must mean that the children are free. They're free from taxation. And so Peter must agree with that. So Jesus, in other words, by implication, is saying we must be free, because he goes on to say, notwithstanding, we don't want to offend them. We must be free, but notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, then go to the sea, cast and hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money, that take and give unto them for me and thee. Now the clue to the whole matter is to know that 2 drachmas, or a didrachmon, equals 1/2 shekel. The half shekel is the Jewish term. The 2 drachmas, or the didrachmon, is the Greek term. Now since we know definitely that the didrachmon, or the 2 drachmas, equals a 1/2 shekel, then we know what type of tax is being discussed here. Then we are given some clue as to who the questioners are. They're not Romans. They're religious people concerned about whether this new uprising religious sect following Jesus the Nazarene here, if this new sect that claims to be of God is going to base their life and ministry on the law of Moses. Are they going to pay what the law of Moses said? Notice it's back to a 1/2 shekel now. Financial state in Israel is better than in post-exilic times in Nehemiah and Ezra's books. So it's gone up from 1/3 shekel. That was just temporary there, and God approved of that for a temporary measure. It's back up to 1/2 shekel. That lets you know also, for this time as well as for the Old Testament, that a 1/2 shekel was 2 days' wage. Okay, you only work so many days out of the year. And that doesn't count. Now, this isn't a tithe or anything, or the second tithe, or the third year tithe. This is 2 days' wages, the whole wage for that day. And you couldn't work 1 hour. I mean, it was a day's wage, a regular day's work. 2 days every year, your income from 2 days went just to the temple, to the sanctuary, to the tabernacle, for the maintenance and upkeep of the work that had to be done there. Eventually the vessels are just going to wear out from use. You're going to have to rebuild the vessels. All of that money was kept there to supply things of that nature. And so what they're doing, they're coming and asking Peter, because he's part of this new Nazarene group here, do you people abide by the law of Moses? Does your master, but he doesn't use the Old Testament term because you wouldn't find that here in the New Testament. The shekel would be an Old Testament term. Uses the New Testament, the Greek term, the didrachmon, or the 2 drachmas. So that's what he's talking about here. Doth not your teacher pay the law of Moses half shekel? Now, the reason I say it doesn't seem like Peter really knows what he's talking about. He says yes, but he doesn't know the implications behind what he means, what he says, assuming that he knows that Jesus pays it. Why? He doesn't know anything about that. And so the reason I'm saying that seems to be a good suggestion, is because Jesus never would have questioned him in the end of verse 25 if Peter knew all of what was taking place there. So then he says, what thinkest thou, Simon, of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute, of their own children or of strangers? Well, it kind of depends on what type of custom or tribute. I mean, the kings of our country take tribute of their children. That's you and myself. As well as strangers. Whenever strangers import things into this country, then they put big taxes on that. But he's talking about something different here. Peter saith unto him, of strangers. Jesus saith unto him, then are the children free. Now, I don't want to really get into an interpretation, but probably one of the best interpretations of what Jesus means. Because if you try to break this down like I just did, we know that all governments tax their own people. That's the legitimate right of a government, local, federal government. It's a legitimate right if they provide the land, the services for you to live on and to enjoy, then it's their legitimate right to put a reasonable tax upon the people. But yet, Peter and Jesus both think that the children should be free. So he's in a religious context here. He uses, just by analogy, kings of the earth and their custom and tribute. But he's into a religious question. He's probably really talking about the Father in heaven as king. And this new uprising Nazarene band here, they are really the children of God. They are part of the kingdom of God, and this temple tax for them has passed away. Who are the strangers here in this context then? Old Testament Israel. They're the strangers to God because they don't know his son, Jesus Christ, here. The apostles know him as God. They know the king here. And the king's not going to tax his own son here. He's going to let his son go free. He'll just tax the strangers out there. So children cannot be made synonymous with the residents of that country. Children are those in the immediate vicinity and intimacy of the one doing the taxing, the king or the Father in heaven. So that's probably one of the best interpretations of what he's talking about. Jesus makes quite a cleavage then between himself along with his apostolic band and those questioning them. That's Old Testament Israel. They're still back there under the law. If they would just recognize me as God, they'd recognize I've come to set into motion a new economy, a new dispensation here, where all of these old things from the Mosaic law, which were just shadows of things to come, all of these things have already passed away. But Jesus said, lest we offend them, we'll go ahead and pay the temple tax here to keep ourselves in the country and to give ourselves a potential audience. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, then go to the sea and cast a hook and take up the fish that first cometh, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find, and now the margin also gives it to us, a stater, S-T-A-T-E-R. That's the technical term here. You have to know these terms, and then you have to kind of know an explanation behind them. And then they give it to us in shillings and so forth, and that's just not valid. You can just strike all of that out. The only thing that's interesting for is it will date you back to 1611 King James English and times days. A stater. What in the world was a stater? A stater was 4 drachma, or 2 didrachma, or 1 shekel. Give it to you in the New Testament and the Old Testament economy. A stater, S-T-A-T-E-R, stater, was 4 drachma, 2 didrachma, because 2 drachmas make up 1 didrachmon, or for Old Testament, it's 1 shekel. Okay, you have all that down, and you understand that a shekel, how much of a shekel equals a didrachmon equals a drachma. You know how to convert those to one another then. Okay, we won't practice with you because it's not that important, but as long as you got that much down, then you could convert it. Okay, then what's his point here? Don't go any beyond, just what's his point here? Why does he go now from the didrachmon, from 2 drachmas, and he says the stater? For 2 of them. Because it pays 2 halves of 1 shekel. And notice the rest of the verse, that take and give unto them from me and thee. He doesn't pay for the rest of the apostles. He just pays for Peter here because he's the one that caught the fish. So he just pays for Peter. And it was a half shekel for Peter, a half shekel for Jesus, a stater, 4 drachma, 2 didrachmon, or digdrachma, and that would pay the annual temple tax for this year. Now, he had to pay for other years as well, but that would pay for this year. You see, evidently he had not paid at this time, or he wouldn't pay again. Peter said, they asked, does he pay? And Peter said, yes. And evidently Jesus hadn't paid, or he wouldn't be paying now, because they're not going to put it on his account. Well, they'll take care of what? The year 26 AD is what they'll take care of for you. No, you have to pay that year. So evidently he hadn't paid. So Peter said yes impetuously, as he said many other things impetuously. So, now that's interesting, is it not? What all of Matthew 17 is about. It has nothing to do with Roman taxation at all. It's purely a religious, purely an Israel question here. So if you can get all that corrected to the didrachmon, the drachmas, the staters, the half and full shekels, then I think you'll have a pretty good understanding of those 4 verses.